Welcome to another episode of the OLA Adult Ed Faith Formation Weekly Gospel Podcasts. We are back on the campus of St. Bonaventure High School. Max is back behind the camera. I am back in front of the camera. This is Palm Sunday, and since we're in the year of Matthew, I should say, we are in the Gospel of Matthew, and we are in two chapters of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 26 and Matthew chapter 27. And as I mentioned last podcast, if you listened or watched, that because of the length of this Sunday's gospel reading, two chapters, I'm going to split this into two podcasts. This podcast, I'm going to focus on 4 or 5 things in chapter 26. Next podcast, I'll focus on 4 or 5 things of chapter 27. That way, you can either watch one, take a break, and then watch the other, or you can watch them back to back. So 2, hopefully, normal length broadcasts instead of one massive broadcast. That's the plan, to get through Matthew chapters 26 and 27, which is the gospel reading for Palm Sunday. Now, a couple of other items. We call this Palm Sunday, and rightly so. We get that name because of the Gospel of John. All the other Gospels record that the people were lining the streets and they were waving leafy branches. John indicates that the branches they were waving are palm branches. So we get the fact that we call this Palm Sunday because of how John records it. And actually, the full name of this Sunday is Palm Sunday of the Passion of the Lord, because we hear the Passion narrative on Palm Sunday. So a couple of other items just to start off. Again, Matthew 26, this podcast, Matthew 27, next podcast, are principles, context, context, context. Read, watch, and listen closely because words have meaning. And again, not a verse-by-verse unpacking. I'm going to bring out, as I have been during the Lenten readings, 4 or 5 aspects of the reading to kind of bring out, unpack, so when you do hear the verses, you can set these verses against this context, against this background, and that'll kind of bring the verses to light a little bit more for you. So with that said, Matthew 26, and of course what we're talking about in these two chapters, Matthew covers the passion, death, and burial of Jesus. So with that said, let's start by looking at verses 1 and 2 and contrasting them with verses 3 to 5, because the first thing Matthew does in chapter 26 is he sets up a very stark contrast between two groups of people. Verses 1 and 2, what does Matthew record? He records Jesus talking to his disciples. That's one group of people, Jesus and his disciples. And this is what Jesus tells them. You know that after 2 days the Passover will be here, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. So let me have you tuck that word delivered in the back of your mind, because we're going to see that again very shortly. So first group of people, Jesus telling his disciples that in 2 days he's going to be delivered up and crucified. Then Matthew shifts the focus very quickly to a second group of people. We see this group in verses 3 to 5. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people, that's group 2, gathered together in the court of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they took counsel together how they might seize Jesus by stealth and put him to death. So we've got one group of people, Jesus and his disciples, Jesus telling the disciples he's going to die, and then we've got a second group of people, the chief priests and the elders, plotting on how they are going to get Jesus to die. So right off the bat, Matthew puts front and center for us the two groups of people that are going to be main characters, Jesus and his disciples, and then the chief priests and the elders. So that's the first thing we want to bring out, is the immediate and the stark contrast with which this Sunday's gospel reading starts out with. Now let's move a little further. Let's go down to verses 14 and 16. And here we'll see Judas cut his deal to portray Jesus. And this tells us a couple of things, okay? Judas goes to these chief priests and says, look, what will you give me in order to, to betray him? And Judas asking for money in order to deliver Jesus to them, in order to betray Jesus. This gives us one of the reasons why Judas ultimately is going to betray Jesus. Judas, we know, is the treasurer of the group. He kept the money bag. He was in charge of the incoming money and the outgoing money. And we were told that he was stealing from the money bag. So Judas was a thief, okay? He was very greedy. And his greed comes out because he says, what will you give me in order to deliver him to you? So we get one of the two reasons Judas betrays Jesus right here. His greed. He wants money to do so. And then we know that they count out 30 pieces of silver, which happens to be the price of a slave. Now, Judas, greedy as he is, accepts the 30 pieces of silver. He doesn't hold out for more. He accepts the 30 pieces of silver, which is the price of a slave. And that gives us a little window into what Judas thinks of Jesus. Because Judas has developed such an anger. He despises Jesus so much at this point in time that he's willing to accept just the price of a slave to betray Jesus. That's what he thinks of Jesus. So I bring out verses 14 to 16 when Judas cuts his deal to bring out one of the reasons he betrays Jesus, because he's greedy. And it brings out a second thing. It shows us, it's a little window into how he views Jesus as worth nothing more than the price of a slave. The second reason, by the way, that Judas betrays Jesus is there was a group. They were called the Zealots, right? And when they read the scriptures, when they read the prophecies, that one day God would send a Messiah, he would be a king, he would deliver his people, they were hoping that this Messiah would be a political and a military king. And he would start a revolution which would deliver them from Rome, right? Judas eventually comes to the understanding that this is not the type of Messiah Jesus is. He's not a political military Messiah. He's not going to start a political military revolution. He's not going to free them from the oppression of Rome, okay? He's going to free them from Satan and sin. Now, Judas was in alignment with the Zealots. So when Judas realized this is not the kind of Messiah Jesus was going to be, Judas, after devoting 3 years of his life to following Jesus, all of a sudden now figures, I've wasted 3 years of my life following a guy that's not who I thought he was, that's not going to do what I thought he was going to do. That's another reason where anger and bitterness and resentment and despisement built up with Judas. So it's always been traditionally taught that Judas betrayed Jesus for two reasons. One is greed, which is brought out here. The other is that misplaced belief on the type of Messiah that Jesus was going to be. But be that as it may, Judas he cuts his deal to betray Jesus for the price of a slave. Now, let's move forward a little bit more. And I want to focus on verses 21 to 25, okay? Now, this is where Jesus calls out Judas as his betrayer. It's the upper room. It's during the Last Supper, right? And Jesus calls Judas out as his betrayer. And listen to how Matthew records it, okay? Now, when evening arrived, this is Holy Thursday night, he, Jesus, reclined at table with the 12 disciples. Judas is there, right? And while they were eating, he, Jesus, says, "Amen, I say to you, one of you will betray me." Now, if you're one of the disciples, that has got to rock your world, all right? To hear that Jesus is going to be betrayed at all, let alone by one of them that is sitting around the table, that's got to be mind-blowing, all right? That's got to rock their world big time, right? And being very much saddened, they each began to say, "Is it I, Lord?" But he answered and said, "He who dips his hand with me in the dish, he will betray me." Right? And turns out that Jesus gives Judas a piece of bread, right? They dip it in the dish. So in doing that, Jesus indicates that Judas is the betrayer, right? And then Jesus says something very ominous. He says, "The Son of Man indeed goes his way as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better for that man if he had not been born." Okay? Now, this is the first time of a number of instances that Jesus actually gives Judas a chance to back away from his plan. He gives Judas a chance to have second thoughts, to think through this, and to not go through with it. And unfortunately for Judas, he does. But this is the first time, okay? Because Jesus, in indicating it's better that this man not be born, if you're Judas and you're hearing those words, you would think you might be saying, oh man, that's a pretty harsh statement. Maybe I better think again about what I'm about to do. Maybe, this is, I'm crossing a line here. Maybe as angry and as bitter and as resentful that I am, maybe that's a step too far. Because to say that it's better that this man not even be born and this man is me, wow, maybe I better think again about what I'm about to do. Okay? So it's in that vein that Jesus essentially telling Judas this, okay, without telling him to it directly, but Jesus putting this out there and hanging out there, okay, for all the 12, and Judas knowing he's talking about him, you would hope that would give Judas pause to back away, but it doesn't. So this is really the first time Jesus gives Judas a chance to back away by giving him this ominous statement that woe to the man that's betraying me, it's better that he not be born. That's pretty ominous, that's pretty harsh, and he's giving Judas a chance to rethink. Judas does not, okay? The other interesting thing is each of the disciples, when they hear that one of them is going to betray him, notice what each of the other 11 say. They say, "Is it I, Lord?" Judas says, "Is it I, Rabbi?" Now, the other 11 disciples address Jesus as Lord. Judas just addresses Jesus as Rabbi. Doesn't address him as Lord, just addresses him as Rabbi or teacher. That's an interesting difference between how the other 11 think and believe and address Jesus and how Judas thinks and believes and addresses Jesus. Lord versus Rabbi, verses 21 to 25. Okay? Now, let's move on to verse 30 and 31. Okay? They finished the Last Supper. They finished the Passover meal. And then Matthew records they leave the upper room and they're singing a hymn. And, the question is, well, I wonder what hymn they were singing, right? And then maybe some hymns come to mind. Were they singing On Eagle's Wings? Obviously not. That hadn't been written yet. Were they singing Amazing Grace? Obviously not. That hasn't been written yet. Were they singing Taste and See? Obviously not. That hasn't been written yet. So what hymn were they singing? They were singing the great Hallel, which is Psalms 114 to 118. And if you look at Psalms 114 to 118, they are enthronement psalms for a king. They are psalms of praise and glory. So they're singing these psalms on the way from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane, where the agony, arrest, and where this whole thing is going to really start playing out. Interesting, okay? Now let's move to verses 36 to 46. And let's take a look at the agony itself, right? Couple of things we want to bring out here, right? Let's see how Matthew records it. Then Jesus came with them to a country place called Gethsemane. Now we're on the Mount of Olives. We're in a garden within the Mount of Olives. That garden is called Gethsemane. Gethsemane means oil press. And the reason it's called oil press or Gethsemane is it's in a garden on the Mount of Olives, right? And there are olive trees. So what they would do is they would gather the olives off these trees, bring them into the garden where there's an olive press. They would press down with this olive press on the olives, and that's how they would make their olive oil. So it was called Gethsemane because it had an olive press, and the reason it had an olive press is because it was on the Mount of Olives. So they went to Gethsemane, and Jesus says to his disciples, "Sit down here while I go over yonder and pray." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee. Now, who are the two sons of Zebedee? James and John. So he takes Peter, James, and John further into the garden with him so as to witness this, right? And Peter, James, and John, we know, are the inner three. These are the same three he took up the Mount of Transfiguration and allowed them to see his transfiguration. And we said back in that podcast, which started the Lenten season, we said that the reason he took these three up there and showed them, his transfiguration, showed him his glory, is so that they, when they see his passion and death, that they can recall this event and realize he's not just a man, he's God. This is not a defeat, it's an actual victory. So he takes the same three people he took up the Mount of Olives, Peter, James, and John, further into the Garden of Gethsemane with him to witness this agony. Okay? So if you're going, well, who were the two sons of Zebedee? James and John. So the three he took up were the famous inner three, right? Then he goes into his agony, right? And then the next thing that we want to point out is we know that, he prays, they're sleeping. He goes back and prays, they're sleeping again, right? And then finally, he comes out, finds them sleeping, and he says to Peter, "Could you not watch 1 hour with me? Watch and pray that you may not enter the temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Two things I want to point out here. The famous verse that we oftentimes kind of say, oh, the spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. And people say, well, is that biblical? And we answer, yes, it is. And if they say, well, where exactly in the Bible would I find that? Sometimes we go, I know it's in the Bible, but I'm not exactly sure where. Well, now we know where, okay? Jesus utters it when he comes out yet again and sees Peter and them sleeping. That's where that famous phrase, that's where we can find it in the Bible. The other thing I want to bring out is, could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Now, what is he doing? He's praying, right? They are in his presence. He's praying. He is asking them to pray. And they can't seem to do it because they keep falling asleep. So if we're ever asked, you Catholics, you make a holy hour in front of the Blessed Sacrament exposed, right? In front of the real presence of Jesus. Is this making a holy hour in front of the real presence of Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament exposed? Is that even biblical? We can answer, yes, indeed, it's biblical, and we can trace the roots of it back to right here. Jesus' agony in the garden. He is asking them to take an hour and to watch and pray in his presence. Okay? What do we do when we make a holy hour? We watch and we pray in the real presence of Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament exposed. So I want to bring that out. Now, moving further forward, let's move to verses 47 and 56. Now we move to the arrest itself, right? And again, we get a little peek into Judas and what he feels about Jesus. Because again, this is first century, right? You don't have social media, you don't have YouTube, you don't have people sending pictures all over the place, right? So when the temple guards and when some of the Roman soldiers arrive at the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest Jesus, number one, it's pitch black, and there's no street lights, right? Number two, a lot of these individuals may have never seen Jesus up close. They might not even know what he looks like. And he's one of the many disciples in the garden. So when Judas, when he arranges, look, I know where he's going to be. He's going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane, because that's where we would go a lot of times to kind of get some peace and quiet and pray. That's where he's going to be. That's where I'm going to lead you, right? So they come with clubs and they come with torches because it's pitch black. They come with clubs because they don't know if Jesus and his disciples are going to fight back. So they want to be well armed, right? They arrive at the Garden of Gethsemane. It's pitch black. Jesus is there with the 11 other disciples. You know, these people don't necessarily know what he looks like by sight. So Judas had arranged previously, no worries, I'll point him out to you. And the person I point out, that's who you go and arrest. Now again, Judas could have used any number of ways to point Jesus out. He could have pointed to him and said, that's the one. He could have come up behind him and put his hand on his shoulder and said, that's the one, right? Instead, Judas says, the one I kiss is the one that you want to arrest. And that gives us a peek into Judas's thinking about Jesus, like I said, because the kiss that Judas is going to kiss Jesus with, that's the type of kiss that was reserved for just family members or very close friends. Yet Judas uses that family, close friend kiss to point out Jesus so they can arrest him and eventually put him to death. That's cold. So that gives us another peek into the window of just what Judas, his thoughts are about Jesus at that moment, right? And then Matthew records that at this point, Peter pulls out a sword and he cuts off the servant of the high priest's ear, right? A couple of things we want to mention about this. Number one, the high priest, his name is Malchus, all right? And Peter cuts off his ear. Now, we've got to say, boy, you know something? It's at night. This is not a dagger, Peter. This is a full-on sword, okay? So for a fisherman, which Peter was, to wield a sword so exactly in the dark of night that to slice off somebody else's ear, Peter had to be an expert swordsman. Think about it. That would be hard to do, right? To wield a large sword and to slice off just the ear of this guy in pitch black, right? In the middle of Jesus being arrested. You'd think Peter had to be one heck of a swordsman. Well, the thinking has always been that Peter was not one heck of a swordsman. He was a fisherman, right? So when Peter wielded that sword, he was doing so to cut off Malchus's entire head. He missed and just cut off his ear. So I just mentioned that for some of the thinking behind that situation, and also the fact that the high priest in another gospel we're told is Malchus. Now, we're also told in another gospel, right, that Jesus heals Malchus's ear, right? Which is a miracle, which the 11 other disciples see, which the temple guards see, which the Roman soldiers see, which Judas sees, right? So just before he's about to be arrested, Jesus performs another miracle. People don't kind of think about it Well, yeah, it is a miracle. Here he, reaches down on the ground and puts Malchus's ear back in place, right? That's a miracle. It's a miracle of healing, right? And it's done right in front of Judas. And this is another instance where, in essence, Jesus is kind of reminding Judas, consider who I am. Consider what you're about to do. It's not too late. It's still not too late to back away. But Judas doesn't do that, obviously, okay? And then let's move on to the last bit of verses 57 to 75 of this particular chapter, right? And now in these verses, you know how we said Matthew sets up this chapter with a contrast between two groups of people, Jesus and his disciples and the chief priests and elders? He finishes this chapter with yet another contrast between two groups of people, right? You've got Jesus inside undergoing his Jewish trials, and then you've got Peter outside in the courtyard denying Jesus. So another contrast of two groups of people, Jesus and the Jewish religious leaders inside, Peter and everybody outside, and Peter's denials, okay? And it's a stark contrast that Matthew ends this chapter with the same way he begins it, right? Now, very interesting, that, here Jesus is literally on trial for his life, while at the same time, Peter's outside denying he even knows them, okay? What a contrast. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is we know that Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Now, after Jesus rises from the dead, one of his post-resurrection appearances is going to be by the Sea of Galilee, right? Where he has a charcoal fire and where he's cooking some fish and where he invites the disciples to have breakfast, right? And it's in that scene where he asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Right? Now, Peter is outside denying Jesus next to a charcoal fire. He's doing it 3 times. Jesus, next to a charcoal fire, basically restores Peter 3 times. Do you love me? So Peter, Jesus in asking Peter, do you love me 3 times, is a 3-fold restoration to Peter's 3-fold denial, and they're both done by a charcoal fire. So with that, again, not a verse-by-verse unpacking, but several things to bring up when you hear the verses. You can set them against this background and this contrast. And even at this point, it's still about 28 minutes long, but it's a lot. And like I said last week, it is Lent, and it is Palm Sunday. So with that, I'll wrap up the Chapter 26 podcast. I will now move into the Chapter 27 podcast, where I'll do basically the same things. And like I said, you can watch one, take a break, watch the other, or watch them back to back. So with that, let me wrap up this podcast, and then let me begin the second podcast. And until then, take care and God bless.